Our last speaker is Professor Tracy Strong. He is the Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of California at San Diego in the Political Science Department. He has broad interest in political theory and its related fields in political science, aesthetics, literature, and many other areas. He's the author of many exciting books, including Nietzsche and the Politics of Transfiguration, currently in its 3rd edition, The Idea of Political Theory, Reflections on the Self in Political Time and Space, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Politics of the Ordinary in its 2nd edition. He's also the editor and co-editor of Nietzsche's New Seas, The Self and the Political Order, Public Space and Democracy, and the One and the Many. Do I keep going?
No,
that's enough, you think?
That's enough.
All right. And he's
it's all one book, right?
It's all one book, but there is a little article or an introduction you wrote with a very wonderful title. So I just, for my own aesthetic pleasure, I want to mention Hammers, Idleness, and Psychologists. That's good. This is the one I like best, I have to confess, having read all your works, naturally. We're very eager to hear you maybe hammer the global crisis in front of our own eyes.
We're more in favor of idleness, thank you. I would normally thank Roger at this point, but since he gave part of my paper, I probably would forego that. And I would probably do the same for the other 2 speakers, but it only goes to show that when we confront the same text, it's a text strong enough so that similar themes actually leap out at you. In 1898, William Jennings Bryan, who was one of the more progressive white American political figures at the turn of the century, had been protesting the imperialism of the U.S. annexation of the Philippines. Theodore Roosevelt responded to him in this manner: "If you were not opposed to the taking of California, you cannot be opposed to the taking of the Philippines." This was imperialism based not so much on the acquisition of resources, though those might come too, but on a desire for universal expansion. The United States was not like earlier imperialisms, the point's just been made. It was simply the expansion, one might say, of an idea or a way of life, an expansion that knew no natural limits, and we've seen some of this in the last 8 years in the Middle East, but also before. Now, Arendt's discussion, what she calls imperialism, the 2nd major section of the Origins of Totalitarianism, very nicely reissued by Schocken, contains the following points. 1. The modern age is the age of world politics. 2. This modern age has seen a shift from the localized and limited goals of national interest to the limitless pursuit of power after power with no certain nationally or territorially prescribed purpose and hence no predictable direction. This is what she calls imperialism, or we might say modern imperialism. She quotes Cecil Rhodes, from who gave us, by the way, Rhodesia and Rhodes scholarships. She quotes Rhodes, "I would annex the planets if I could." 3rd, part of this shift entails the growth of the invisible government over against the visible government, that is, the government which is not in the sight of the citizenry. And 4th, this leads to an erosion, perhaps even a disintegration of the nation state, that is, of the space in which human beings belong and live as citizens. The erosion of the nation state, she argues, is consequent to imperialism and, quote, proved to contain nearly all the elements necessary for the subsequent rise of totalitarian movements. Before the imperialist era, there was no such thing as world politics, and without it, the claim to global rule would not have made sense. And you might take the words global rule important as part of what was in contest during the Cold War. Her worry is, in fact, that the present age might turn out analogous to the period immediately prior to World War I, the focus of her book, where a small incident triggered an unprecedented disaster. Statelessness is a danger it is worth noting that Nietzsche had already identified in 1871. Now, Arendt does not have much to say about fiscal crises. The Great Depression of 1929 and following does not even make the index to her book. And we know that she was, at least supposedly, hostile to the affairs of the oikos. The opposition between the political and the economic is very sharp. So the first question we must ask is how the kind of imperialism that she describes, this new modern imperialism, might be related to the current fiscal crisis. She distinguishes modern imperialism from acquisition of territory imperialism, the model of Rome or China. What has happened in modern imperialism is that a principal characteristic of capitalist economic behavior has become the driving engine of what passes today for what we still call politics, incorrectly for her. Consider the basic form of commodity exchange. I have 2 bushels of wheat, which I sell to you for 12 pairs of shoes, which I sell to someone else for 3 front doors, which I sell to you again for 5 pit bulls, and so on. The fundamental insight that Marx had into capitalism is that production was for the purpose of exchange. Money makes this more efficient, and only secondarily for the purpose of use. The point here is that the nature of economic production under modern capitalism is not primarily to be for a goal, use, but to be constantly oriented towards the future, a future that has, however, no natural ending point, no goal. This has become increasingly, and now is, the dominant form of economic behavior and is characteristic of what she calls imperialist behavior. I do not need to rehearse here in extended detail the elements of this transformation, but to remind you briefly. They are: 1, the enormous increase in capital transfers across the entire world. In 1997, on a typical day, world capital markets would move $1.3 trillion at a time when the total yearly value of world exports was $3 trillion. By 2007, daily market capital transfers were $3.2 trillion, which is equivalent to $2.2 billion a minute. Yearly totals of world exports are now 17.9 trillion. Second, political aims are by definition, the point has been made, specific and limited. Economic aims have no closed end. Third characteristic of this, the rise of international and bodies pursuing regional and international policy. Worldwide, there are almost 50,000 registered NGOs with a group called WANGO, World Association of NGOs, of which, by the way, tellingly, proportionally the fewest and absolutely the fewest are in China. Fourth, we see the efforts of global corporations and financiers to divorce themselves from state regulation and tax regimes. With a few exceptions, it no longer makes sense to think in terms of national financial markets. They are increasingly being integrated into a single global one as cross-border holdings of financial assets and cross-border flows of capital, just mentioned, grow. Today, for example, foreigners hold 12% of U.S. equities, 25% of U.S. corporate bonds, 44% of Treasury securities, up from 4%, 1%, and 20% respectively in 1975. Cross-border capital flows create stronger links among national markets and clearly show that despite the past decade's financial crises and the backlash against globalization, the world capital market continues to integrate and evolve. Fifth, it's been mentioned, the increasing governing of nations and principles of economic growth, and going along with this, sixth, the rise of businessmen where there were once politicians. As Peter Mandelson, the EU Trade Commissioner, said recently, it's most likely that businessmen and entrepreneurs, rather than diplomats, ministers, and special commissioners, will provide for economic and rapprochement between Russia and the EU. Against this, we see the particular genius that Arendt saw in the national state. The national state is her possible site for what she calls the political, that is, for a group of people who understand themselves as sharing and pursuing a common historical identity. Indeed, should the nation-state engage in conquest, as it did in the early pursuit of colonies, it will, she argues, necessarily eventually arouse national feelings in that which it conquers, which in turn will lead the conquered land to rebel in a national consciousness. Hence, the French conquest of Algeria eventually produces the FLN and an independent Algeria, despite the attempt to declare at one point Algeria a department of France. Colonialism is thus distinct from what she sees as contemporary imperialism, and the point's extremely important. As she remarks, what imperialists actually wanted was expansion of political power without the foundation of a body politic. And she continues, this is almost the only one of my quotes hasn't been given. For the first time, investment of power did not pave the way for investment of money, but export of power followed meekly in the train of exported money. Since uncontrollable investments in distant countries threatened to transform large strata of society into gamblers, to change the whole capitalist economy from a system of production into a system of financial speculation, and to replace the profits of production with profits in commission. If that's not close to a description of what's been going on now, I don't know what would be. Arendt laments the consequences of developments that give rise to, quote, the existence of people who live outside the common world, who are human beings in general, without citizenship, representing nothing but their own absolute unique individuality. She is worried here about the demise of the political, of citizenship, and of the saliency and of the lack of saliency of the territorial nation that was once its cradle. The seemingly uplifting Baha'i proclamation that the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens is for her dangerously misleading, a false rationalization of the imperialism she deplores. Ironically, however, the same terms can be applied to international financial actors, the imperialists, who, however, do not, as Arendt does, lament the non-relevance of their citizenship, or very often these days their citizenships, but on the contrary revel in it. It is clear that in this globalized world, the traditional domestic instruments of politics in the economic realm, taxation and regulation, have lost much of their effectiveness in the globalized environment. Such policies now require the coordination of several states, a coordination extremely hard to bring off. From Arendt's point of view, this is the worst of two worlds. The erosion of the nation-state gives rise to imperialism. The residue of the nation-state structure now impedes the solution to the problems of what she's calling imperialism. The globalization of economic actors, of the media, of financial transactions, escapes to a great degree the control of nation-states. In relation to these developments, most governments, in particular that of the United States, flail or bewail their powerlessness. It is possible that in Europe we are beginning to see developments that might go beyond this. Nietzsche had predicted that Europe wants to become one. We shall see. And here there's a paradox. The French distinguish between what they call globalization and what they call mondialisation. I'll say what it is in a minute. The former, globalization, designates the extension of economic rationality to all human activities. It is the basis of Arendt's notion of imperialism. It is the march towards an integrated global market. This is McDonald's in Tiananmen Square. Mondialisation, there is one, by the way. There's also one, and not just there. Mondialisation, from the French word monde, the world, refers to the extension to the planet of all forms of exchange, cultural, political, social, and philosophical. However, these two realities interact. To take just one aspect, the consequences for the physical environment, the loss of biodiversity, deforestation, pollution, global warming, are consequences that take place on a planetary level and are clearly the result of the interaction of cultural, political, and social factors along with economic ones, the factors of Arendt's imperialism. From her point of view, the fiscal crisis has the same origins as the environmental one, and it's worth thinking about that relationship. Thus, we have problems that are might be predicted by Arendt, but for which the solution may not be clear in Arendtian terms. I've recently returned from 2 weeks in China, where I was impressed by the concerted effort to deal with carbon emissions. a necessary effort you will know if you've tried to breathe the air in Beijing. If you industrialize in 30 years, as the Chinese have done, it does focus the mind marvelously, however. Compared to the US, the coherence of Chinese policies is impressive, and one can only ask if what passes for the present American political system is able to deal with these problems. Congress will be unable to have a coherent policy by the Copenhagen summit this December. Can we still have citizenship, political community? It seems doubtful. For modern developments, the ones she described as imperialism have undermined the foundation of the political, a foundation that must rest on citizenship, membership, inclusion, and exclusion. Everything now seems double-edged. That which puts me in face-to-face contact by computer teletalk with a friend in Beijing also allows the transfer of $2.2 billion a minute. We need some new understanding of citizenship. And coming from Arendt's problems, I see a number of problems that are hard to deal with in terms of our traditional conception of citizenship. First, I think, is the fact that in modern times, it has become increasingly difficult to, in principle, exclude anyone from claiming membership in a particular polity. This means that anyone can claim to be a member. One thinks here in the struggles in this country of those coming over the border for work, or those in Europe who seek asylum in Germany, Denmark, or the Netherlands. There is presently a large group of sans-papiers, we call them undocumented, people in France claiming the right of residency and membership. On what grounds can we exclude them? Should we exclude them? Most arguments for exclusion are either economic, they spend too much time in hospitals, or nativistic. They don't speak English. But they're not political in our sense. Second problem, in our modern age, decisions now arise on a whole range of issues that concern simply what the Italian philosopher Agamben called zoe, bare life. These include genetically modified crops, medical technologies, surrogate mothering, cloning, and so forth. Biological life itself is presently becoming subject to changes that escape any conceivable understanding we have of sovereignty. The domain of potentially political concerns is thus dramatically extended by technology. But these are still often thought of in economic terms. There are already widely substantiated rumors of international traffic in organs, and it will be proved feasible in the not too distant future to clone organs as replacement parts. Think of the market that will open up. Third, as briefly noted above, the modern world has produced a whole new kind of people. They come from what we now call failed states, which is a strange concept. They may be asylum seekers from culturally oppressive regimes. They may be illegal aliens in search of employment that cannot be found at home. They may be prisoners in Guantanamo. Arendt notes that we now call them displaced persons, not even, as we used to, stateless persons, the very idea of the state having dropped out there. Approximately 3% of the world's population, 200 million people, live outside the country of their birth, for by far the greatest part, not by their own desire. What to do? I suspect that while we will in the end recover from the present fiscal crisis, though as Keynes once remarked, in the end we're all dead, the deep structures and transformations that have given rise to it will not go away and will return in one form or another. Perhaps we need an equally deep transformation. It will involve a certain amount of re-education. While I understand the enthusiasm that the Chinese have, with which the Chinese have embraced the automobile, it has been unfortunate. Maurice Strong, who was the moving force behind the 1972 Stockholm Earth Summit, 1992 Rio Earth Summit, and the forthcoming one in Copenhagen, today a major player in China's policies towards the environment, once said, "It is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, consumption of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods, ownership of motor vehicles, small electric appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable. A shift is necessary towards lifestyles less geared to environmental damaging consumption patterns." On this issue at least, We must realize that we are part of nature, and nature must not be only something that's out there for us to take something from, a standing reserve, as the philosopher Heidegger once called it, simply ready, waiting to be turned into energy. It must not be that. If the nature of what Arendt calls imperialism is to acquire without limit, humans will have to set limits, or nature will impose them on us, and not kindly. If we do, however, then perhaps what Arendt called love of the world could be the basis for a new politics. I want to add one thing as a footnote here, which occurred to me in listening to the previous talk, which has to do with the question of what to do or what one can do. There's a passage in The Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck, where a farmer is being dispossessed, is about to be dispossessed, not an irrelevant thing these days. And the agent from the bank comes to him and says, you've got to leave, you aren't paying your mortgage, you're being thrown out. And the farmer goes and gets a rifle and says, I'm going to shoot you. And the agent says, you don't really want to shoot me. He says, why not? Because if you shoot me, another agent will come from the bank. And you'll have to shoot him. Well, then I'll shoot him. Well, if you do that, then another agent will come from further east. Or they'll send somebody from the East Coast. And pretty soon, you'll never run out. You'll never solve your problem by shooting me. And the farmer finally says, well, who can I shoot? Thank you.